World. I'm Steve Rao, the host of Pod and Roku TV's World Edition. I greet you live from the All-America city of Mooresville in North Carolina, the eighth largest state in the United States of America. And on this show, we talk about global affairs, innovation, an increasingly turbulent world politically, economically, and of course, as we gear every month that goes by, we get closer and closer to 2024 and the presidential elections. Today, I want to spend a few minutes talking about President Joe Biden. He basically arrived in Britain ahead of the NATO summit in the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius. Many Western allies would like the president to back Ukraine's membership of NATO eventually, but President Biden said a vote on this would be premature, and he's telling President Erdogan of Turkey that he hopes to see Sweden join NATO as soon as possible. Turkey has blocked Sweden's bid to join the alliance. And yesterday, in an interview with Fareed Zakaria, President Biden, who spent about 35 minutes with Fareed Zakaria, talked about this very issue. When asked the tough question about why he would run again when so many people cited his age, the president responded that he believed that it was just wanted to complete the job that he started and that in age comes wisdom. But many people in his own party are really asking him to not run again. But the question is, who would be his heir apparent? Kamala Harris is also not popular among Democrats to be the forebearer of the party. So this is something we might talk about in the show and over the next coming few weeks. Meanwhile, continued banter between Twitter and Meta. Between Meta and on the threads. And the lawsuits there on IP. And I've been realizing that China's economy is slowing down significantly. And the president was asked some real tough questions about China and really wasn't really clear about his stances towards China. It's very clear that China is really getting aggressive about being the major superpower, the major economy, and the major defense power in the United States. The world, surpassing the United States. And I think that the premier of China really wants to redefine the international order. And when he met with President Biden, even when Biden was the vice president, told him that China was not a part of the system when the international rules were put in place. And so not a real direct answer from the president, but definitely seems that this is the new rivalry in the world, China and the United States. I'm going to open up the show now. I have be here for a few minutes with us. Not sure what else is going on in the world. I'm going to have Mark Lee. The final thing I'll say is cricket. We have a major cricket championships coming in Morrisville next week, the Major League Cricket Championships. There's a T20 tournament that's coming in August. I was at a draft party on Saturday night in Raleigh where people from around the country were there. And it's quite amazing. So we are going to have some guests from Major League Cricket on the show in the next few days and next week leading up to the national tournament. So with that being said, let's get started. I'm proud to be the host of a wonderful show. And Mark, let's go ahead and bring in our guests and get started.
Yeah, regular panelists, not necessarily guests from outside this time, even though I think I have a guest from outside on Tuesday and all in that space, even though Shaquille is bringing a guest in that has been on the show before, and we'll see what he's got on his mind as well. I'm surprised you didn't mention one of your other favorite sports as well, because the Wimbledon is going on, and of course the tennis is definitely taking place. A lot of people are paying attention to the tennis matches and all along those lines. So I'm surprised you didn't mention that.
And Chris, no, I forgot. I'm sort of in a rush today, but Chris Eubanks, who actually was in Cary at the tournament in here at the Atlantic Tire, is actually playing right now on center court and just took the second set off of Tsitsipas from Greece. And so, amazing story. I was going to begin with that tomorrow. Well, it wins, but he was 500 or 600 in the world, and he's now 40 in the world. A graduate of Georgia Tech, and amazing story. A black man, big serve, and really, if he wins, he'll go into the quarterfinals of Wimbledon. So, although my money's on Novak, he's looking too strong. He's playing again later today, up 2 sets to law. They suspended play. Novak will be then, if he wins Wimbledon, which they are predicting he will be the greatest player ever, the GOAT, at I think 24 majors. So, the
Yeah,
Serbian.
that's definitely a major thing going on. Like I said, I'll bring in Jatovi as well as Shaquille, and I know that he's got Derek with him also. So we'll see what other items that they've got on their mind. I was going to mention one other sports thing and just a note of personal privilege and all, but as Shaquille and Jatovi know, I work at a African American Cultural Arts Center, and I had the privilege yesterday of the entire Duke basketball team, or at least the majority of them, coming by the center to actually get a tour, learn about the history of Durham, learn about its African American heritage, learn about its connection to Duke University, because there is a mural of Washington Duke, one of the founders of Duke University, on that particular venue and all in that space. So we had a lovely conversation with Mark Anthony Neal, who teaches at that university, who I'm trying to get to come by and speak on a number of things because he is part of their African American studies and all in that space. But they were coming by and got a tour that lasted about an hour. They even went downstairs. There is a store that is down there, and they bought some items and all along those lines. So that is a independent contractor that is down there, and definitely it was great that he got the support from the athletes and the basketball team. And like I said, we had a very enriching conversation. Quite a few of them were not from Durham or even North Carolina. I think there were only two that were from North Carolina. The rest were from around the world, because Duke, of course, is an international team and all in that space. So they came from all over, and it definitely was great to be able to give them that conversation and to have some dialogue back and forth and all along those lines. So that was amazing. And I wish Lee Newton Rhodes was here, because one of the things that he oftentimes talks about and definitely talks about regularly is we have conversations around gun violence and things in that nature. But there was a major attack, ironically, that took place in China. And it was in I believe, a kindergarten of all things. And it was a stabbing. So like he oftentimes says, the violence isn't always that of gun violence. And in that particular case, it was a stabbing that took place over there in Linjiang. And that left, unfortunately, 6 dead at that particular preschool there in China, since we oftentimes talk about what's going on in other parts of the world as well. And I know that a lot of things have been happening, including a major appearance that he made, and we didn't get to that last week and everything. So Shaquille, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can definitely tell us about this appearance that you had there in Australia, involving, I think, some of the Australian media that we didn't get to last time, and we definitely need to give you the chance to talk about that and all along those lines. So, and I see you've got Derek with you as well. So I'm turning it over to you, Shaquille. There might be some other news items that we get to as well.
Well, I'll actually hand it over to Derek. So, as you guys know, I was traveling Africa and the Middle East, and Derek actually rang me and said, "Hey, there's been some massive new changes that have been brought out in Western Australia. There's going to be a fairly big meeting with the farmers and some people in the country, Western Australia." So I flew back for that. I think we've gotten, was it 10, 15,000 views on the couple of views that we did there. So it's quite a major development in Western Australia. But I'm going to hand it over to Derek to talk about it first, and then you can bring me in when you need me.
So put it in context, we've had in this state of Western Australia a major majority swing to what we call over here the Labor Party, which is more of your left type party. And in the situation, it was the opposition. In Australia, we have a party type politics where it's not the individual that you're voting for, it's a party you're voting for, kind of like what they have in the UK. And there wasn't much opposition to that. It was a major swing to the Labor, and it's given them incredible power in this state. And many of the legislation that's gone through has gone under the door. In other words, the media haven't been covering it, and most Western Australians don't know what's going on. But it came to light that they were putting through legislation that was in relation to that was going to have a major effect on West Australian farmers in particular, and also our mining industry. Now, keeping in mind that the Australian economy is very much built on the mining industry and also the agricultural industry. And what happened was that they were then pushing to say that if you were going to dig more than 50 centimeters, which is what in feet, about 2.5 feet, foot and a half.
30 centimeters to a foot.
Yeah, so about 1.5 feet. You were going to go any deeper than that, you were going to have to get permission from a representative who would represent the native title in this land. Now, this is a huge problem for people in the agriculture industry because, if a fence needs repair, which often happens, they're repairing fences all the time and livestock escapes, what do? Do they have to go get a consultant to then come in and say, yep, we're okay for you, this is not affecting any of the cultural interests? And huge problems with this because a lot of it was based on what they called spiritual. So there's nothing in the native culture here which actually writes down what the laws are in relation to the spiritual nature of the culture. So it really is throwing darts at a blank board for many West Australian farmers, not knowing where they stand on certain issues. And so this is a huge concern, and they face huge, hefty fines, which when you understand what a farmer goes through to actually put food on the table, most of them are living in overdrafts, can't risk that kind of financial exposure. And so we were trying to get clarity from the government as to what this is all going to mean. This also is coupled with the Voice to Nation, which is legislation that wants to change the Constitution of Australia and put an independent body that represents Aboriginal rights here in Australia to just basically veto any powers that Parliament tries to put through. So there's big concern about this, and I'm noticing that there's an international trend on this where we are somewhat using the guilt of history to try to bring legislation which is having real effects on people's economies and ability to just produce an income. And so the challenge here is, we're watching this in terms of the situations in Europe with France. We're seeing this in Germany. We're seeing this in the United Kingdom and Ireland in particular, where their borders are being basically sovereignty of nations is putting aside. And of course, you've got the situation of the controversy of the border in the United States as well. And we're often throwing this guilt of history around that is affecting people. People for generations really haven't had an effect on this or say on this. So it's fascinating in this time to see this play out across the globe, with the globalists pushing this kind of agenda. And we in WA here, we're trying to support our farmers because we recognize, where does our food come from? So that's the kind of thing that we're dealing with over here. And Shaq was kind enough to fly in from Dubai to show some support to our farmers. And we've been strategizing as to how we can move forward and deal with the situation.
And Derek, just out of curiosity, what exactly, because I know in certain parts of the world when the farmers have been attacked, they have definitely done various types of protests. I even remember, and I don't remember the year, when farmers even here have pulled out their tractors and done other kind of very aggressive kind of protests to let folks know how they feel. I want to say that one time they even drove them down into the DC area and all along those lines. So I was just wondering what kind of strategies are the farmers using? And then the other thing that I was curious to hear your thoughts about is, I know here, and you just kind of alluded to it, there is a lot of migrants that are involved in the farm industry, and it is my understanding that that happens in other parts of the world as well. Now, Australia is on a more of a ocean-bound kind of a country and everything, so I don't know that there are as many migrants that come in to help with the farming situation as there are in some of the European and definitely the North American countries. But I was just wondering your thoughts about both of those, about how the protest is going to be done, or if there are any protest plans, and also the role of the migrants in the farming community, because I know that's a major issue here in North Carolina and around around U.S.
Yeah, I think the difficulty here is, rather than the Netherlands, the situation was quite clear. They wanted to seize farms off these farmers that have been in the family for generations. Here it's a little bit different. There's a vagueness about the legislation, and even if it's in conflict with High Court rulings dating back to the 90s. And so we're trying to get legal clarity on it. And it's been recognized that the government is very disorganized about this as well. So strategizing and putting a plan in place is difficult. But one of the things the farmers do not want to do is put the city folk offside. And that's one of the things that in Australia, we have a real link to the land culturally in relation to where we've come from. part of the convict culture of Australia was that when you became a free man, you could actually own land. And so there is that kind of cultural tie to farming land. We used to call it driving an economy off the back of the sheep. In other words, our wool industry was very, very pertinent in our early formation as a nation. So there's certainly that cultural aspect. The farmers don't want to get offside with the city folk. So they're really looking at clarity as how is this going to play out? What does this actually mean practically for them? But they're very concerned because, this could make or break them financially in many, many situations. And what we don't want to see is multinationals come in and seize the land, and the locals don't have any control over their land anymore, because a multinational can basically put in their old tax terms with government and bypass a lot of this native title strategy anyway. So it's really being seen through as this is not in the interest of cultural heritage. This is control. This is power that someone else can dictate what you do to your land.
I think the other issue I just want to bring up there is it's not just about farmers not wanting to get the city folk offside. The other important thing to remember, and this is something that I talk about a lot in your country as well, is most people, in my opinion, are pretty good. They're just hardworking people that are trying to make a living and just go through life. And I think that the farmers are clearly, they want to comply. They don't want to destroy things of cultural significance to our First Nations people, to use your term. They don't want to do that. But they're facing legislation, regulations that's incredibly unclear. And I think that that's a really unfair but very common thing that government does, is they write a whole heap of laws and they just drop it on you. And then they say, well, comply with it. Or they leave it up to the judiciary to decipher and interpret those laws. And they're not, in my opinion, very responsive to the public when the public says, hey, we're going to have some issues with this. So one of the things, for example, is you might actually have clearance over your land to do certain things. But if you dig a metre down or 2 metres down, then you may possibly come across native, the cultural things of cultural significance. But what do you do at that point? So is it that because you've already been cleared, you're okay? Or do you stop? I mean, what are you supposed to do? The other thing that I think is a real concern is what Derek was alluding to before, was intangible cultural heritage. So they believe in like certain gods, like they've got a snake, for example, that flies through the sky and it changes locations over time. So what they're saying is that you can't do anything to disturb that. Well, the problem with that is it's not something that you can see. And based on the way that they've written these rules, you're not actually allowed to ask, how this snake moves, because it's not part of your culture. So that really leaves people with a very ambiguous situation. It leaves people that are looking at investing in farmland over a long period of time in an ambiguous situation where they don't necessarily know what they're going to be able to do in the future. And it also leaves a position where you can't really appeal this. You can ask for a review, but the review is only done by the minister. So there's no way to have this process judicially reviewed. So if you have somebody who says to you, actually, this has some cultural significance, and it's intangible cultural significance, something that you can't see, your ability to challenge that interpretation doesn't exist. And I think that that is a very dangerous place for farmers and for the community at large to be in. And unfortunately, I think that this is the trend that we're seeing around the world. So it's not that farmers don't want to comply. It's not that people have a problem with looking after, cultural heritage. It's that the laws make it so complicated that people are worried. And at the end of the day, whilst we know that a lot of people don't get prosecuted for things, if a prosecutor doesn't like you or a police officer doesn't like you, they can just keep, trawling through the law books, trawling through the regulations, and they can find something. And what we're talking about here is a fine of up to $10 million for a farmer, and up to 10 years in jail or something. Sure. I can't remember how much jail it is, but you can go to jail, and it's a fine of up to $10 million for any business. Most farmers are set up as businesses. This would put most families out of business. So,
Along those, I had two quick questions, and I was going to make an observation, and then I was going to open it up to the other panelists as well and everything. But Derek, just out of curiosity, one of the things that has happened here in the States, and it is definitely an issue, particularly around farms and around even coastal areas and all along those lines, is that too often, even though it is a very rewarding, and I definitely know it can be a hard work as well, a lot of our young people in those societies are not necessarily wanting to go into that line of work, whether that is fishing down in the coast of North Carolina or even, I guess, in California and Texas and a number of other places. And I know even on the farms that are family owned, sometimes the new generation isn't as excited about that job. They've seen the toil and labor that their parents have gone through, their grandparents have gone through, their great grandparents have gone through, and all along those lines. So, as I'm wondering, in this farming situation in Australia, is there a similar kind of situation, or are the young people being proud of their farming heritage and wanting to still stay in the farming business? Are we seeing a number of the younger farmers that are or farm families that are pushing away from that? Because I know that that has been a problem throughout the United States, and I would argue the West, but I don't know enough about Australia to know if that has been something that y'all have been going through.
You see a bit of both, Mark. Yeah, it's a good question. You see a bit of both. The biggest concern, I think, with this thing that they're pushing in West Australia is the concern that if they roll it out in our state, there's rumours that it might roll out in Queensland as well, and a reciprocal problem nationwide, especially on the federal level where they're doing the voice of the nation and we're having a referendum on that, whether we want that to be passed later on. That's the big concern. But in terms of generational passing down of the land, yes, and that's one of the complaints that the farmers are having, is how does someone who is representing the native interests of the land know what the history of that, let's say 10,000 acres is, because it's been in their family for 10,000 years. In terms of the settlers' point of view, how's that going to be passed on from generation to generation? And can they just make it up on the whim? I mean, there is a side of the notion of the romance of owning land and growing your own food and all that sort of stuff. But essentially, serious farming is a business. And a business, adding more compliance to it when such vagaries surround it really can affect your bottom line, because to get a native title representative to come in and view the land, this can, one, cause delays. We've got climate, when it rains, they've got a week to get the seed in many cases to actually get a crop happening. So the concerns about delay in the process, the concern about the cost of the process, because of course there's going to be a fee every time somebody comes out, which the farmer has to bear, which then affects their bottom line as a business. And it's just this vagueness of, well, how do they know? And if they can just make this up and it's transient, where do I stand? I don't have clarity as a farmer what to do that. And it's not just farmers as well. I mean, it affects, over 1,800 square meters? 1,100 square meters. Anyone who holds that. So what they've cleverly done is all the suburban owners, all the city folk aren't usually affected by that because their land sizes are that big. But somebody who is sitting on that land is affected by it. Let's say they want to put a swimming pool in, right? Just not even farming, but just got a lifestyle type property. This affects them as well, because then they're going to have to get a consultant to come in to add to the cost of putting that pool in. And nobody's really thought this through, but they've targeted a smaller minority of the population. And because it's not a huge concern, doesn't affect everybody, nobody's going to really stand up and protest too much. The also concern on a financial basis too is if they do stuff like start cutting their produce and all that kind of thing, there is concerns that they'll just import it from other parts of the world or interstate as well. So we really have to think carefully for the farmers. This is a business, and what are the long-term effects of affecting it? They've certainly put it at a disadvantage from other farmers in other states because of this legislation. And of course, they have to compete internationally too with importations.
I just want to add
before
to that.
I open it up to definitely to Toby and go ahead, Chico.
Yeah, I just want to add just two quick points. One of them is, this is what I talk about when I talk about race relations. Okay, I actually think that this could be quite offensive to certain members of the Indigenous population in Australia, because what the country is doing is it's looking at them and saying, you're all the same. You all look the same, so therefore you are all the same. And that simply isn't true. Firstly, people within that culture can tell the difference. We may not be able to, but they can tell the difference by looking at each other, where they're from or what sort of tribes they're from. Okay. There are big differences between the needs, wants, traditions of, for example, the saltwater people versus the freshwater people. Massive differences between those Indigenous cultures. And there are smaller Indigenous cultures and tribes that are located all through the land. When you have government come in and centralise power that way, some of those Indigenous people have representation. The others have their voices silenced, and they have no ability to speak because these other groups are apparently speaking on their behalf. So I think that that's very, very dangerous. I think that that is not helpful. That's what I talk about when I talk about Indians and the caste system and all those sort of things that we talk about in relation to race relations. The other thing that I just want to say is that you're actually appointing inspectors who have no law enforcement abilities, but actually have the legal right under this legislation to enter your property and even to seize goods for the purposes of their investigation. So perhaps you've taken your child to the beach and the person thinks that you might have something in your car. They can actually just take your motor vehicle away from you with absolutely, and you've got no legal way to prevent them from doing so that they can examine that. And there's no rules that I've read so far about how long they can take it and under what sort of conditions. So, again, why the Labor Party has done this, I don't know. It's very, very sad to see that the Labor Party, that the Liberals, which is essentially the Republican Party in this country, they didn't win any seats in the last election, in the last state election. So the Labor Party basically took the entire state house, with the exception of, I think, 2 seats, and they basically took the whole Senate. They dropped these rules, I think, 2 days before they were supposed to be passed, before they were supposed to be voted. Some 400 pages was dropped on the very, very small opposition. So I think that this really is an abuse of the process, and I think it's an abuse of the Australian people because the West Australian people had no idea that this was going to happen prior to the election. So I don't think it's useful, and I think the government does a very poor job of responding to what I think are well-founded concerns.
And it's had very little coverage on mainstream media as well. So it's starting to pick up on some of this, and we've really wanted to highlight that with our local press here and independent media outlets. Hey, this is what's going on in our backyard, and it's really striking a note with our local communities.
Now, we have had a question which was directed to me, but you can answer it. What is the impetus behind the government's efforts? Is it completely nefarious? Look, I tend not to think it's nefarious. I tend to think that people mean to do well. The problem is that when government gets involved and tries to do something positive, they're so interested in maintaining their own power and control that they can't take any criticism. They can't listen to people and say, okay, but this might be having an unintended consequence. And in their sort of, excitement or enthusiasm for trying to right the wrongs of the past, I think that they lose perspective, and it's very quick and easy for them to just simply label their people or pose them as being some kind of phobe or ist, rather than actually addressing the real concerns that members of the community have. And I think that's a trend that we're seeing around the Western world.
No, hey, Derek and Shaquille, and then I'll definitely turn it over to Jacoby. Lee Newton Road, who is taking care of Family Matter, has been one of the ones that was asking those 2 questions, and that might have some others as well. But you actually bring up an interesting point that was actually raised to me during that tour that I alluded to yesterday, or actually it was on Saturday as well. But there is, and we've seen it around the United States and around other parts of the world as well, but there are definitely symbols of racism that exist and all of that. And one of the questions that I was asked, and the answer I gave is a true answer, which is that it is a historical building and you just can't randomly take down things and all along those lines. But it is a known fact. It's not a hidden fact. It is a historical fact that Mr. Duke, the founder of Duke, had some racist past and had some other kind of past as well. And one of the things that he requested when they asked him for money to help build what was then the church, it is now a performing arts center, even though it's used by some churches, was a stained glass that puts him in a very patriarchal kind of figure. Like, if you can imagine a stained glass, he's actually more prominent than Jesus is in this particular church. And one of the Duke students asked me, and there's also some stained glasses that are dedicated to Julian Carr, who was a member of the Confederacy, a member of the Klan, and gave some money to the folks in that part of the world. And one of the things that the Duke students asked me is, why didn't the members of the church, who were predominantly African American at the time, take down the stained glass or hide the stained glass or remove the stained glass? And like I told them, it is a historical building. It has historical elements, and you just can't randomly take down stuff, even though there have been name changes and all in that space, even at some of our universities. But I was just wondering, because it kind of is related to what y'all are talking about, what your thoughts are, Derek, about that. Because like I said, a student asked me that it is a very prominent stained glass, and a lot of folks were asking, hey, if it's an insult, why don't you take it down?
I mean, Australia's, I can only comment from an Australian perspective here, Mark, on this situation. I think I haven't, the feedback I'm getting from people is that many people who are Aboriginal aren't wanting this kind of legislation to go through. So the concern is that this is a Trojan horse where they're using the race card as an excuse to pass this kind of legislation that is not actually affecting, it's not bettering the life of the Aboriginal. And that's the biggest thing here. And it's not an us versus them. It's not like the farmers are anti, they're not racist, they're not Aboriginal. They're trying to get clarity on how can they use their land to run a business and feed Australians and export what they do. It's really that. And the concern is that where is the power shift here? How much control do you actually have of your land? I mean, you've got to remember, these are millions and millions of dollars for acreage that these farmers are paying for here to run a business, to produce bread on the table for us. And it's really being seen as a Trojan horse, that the race card is being used to pass legislation where it's really not coming. It's more from activists as opposed to those who are trying to better the Aboriginal life. And one of the problems we have in Australia is our government has poured millions and millions and millions of dollars trying to solve the issues, the guilt of the past, as we put it. It's not working. You can't fix it that way. And this is the issue. And it's really, for the farmers, it's not really an issue of race at all. They just want clarity. What can I do with my land and what can't I?
And I think it's worth noting, Mark, that just as an addition to what Derek just said, not all farmers are white.
No,
you have Aboriginal farmers as well. So in this particular legislation, what happens if an Aboriginal family knows full well that there is no cultural heritage on that particular site, but somebody from a different tribe doesn't like them and says that there is? Who's going to win in that argument if it was going to be reviewed? Because again, there's no judicial review of it. So who's going to win in that argument? I dare say that the government ministers would just err on the side of caution in their eyes and rule in favour of the person making the claim that there is heritage there, as opposed to the people that say that there isn't.
Yeah, and Shaquille, and then I know you told me may want to jump into this as well, but like I said, it is a international conversation that is going on. What is your thoughts about those that are wanting to change the names because of the history? Like I said, I mentioned that there are universities that literally change their names because of the history of Jefferson or Carr or a number of other folks. And like I said, sometimes those are historical buildings and you can't do it as easily as it is thought that you can do it and all in that space. But I just wanted your take, because that is something that we have seen in the United States, we've seen in Canada, we've seen in other parts of the world as well. But I just wanted your take, and Jacoby may have some thoughts as well, but I just wanted your take on people want to make those.
Where even the names of places, I recently took a flight to Sydney, and the name of Sydney was changed to its original Aboriginal name, and I wasn't sure, what it said until it flipped back over to Sydney, and I thought, I don't understand this. I think it's pointless. I had a very interesting conversation with a Maori person on my flight to New Zealand, and he said to me that he, being a Maori, doesn't speak the Maori language, doesn't know anybody that can speak the Maori language, and doesn't understand why there's this big push to put things into that language. But more to your point about changing names, I think that having recognition and and having a prominent place in society is great for people of diverse backgrounds. But I don't think it is necessary for us to tear down the legacy and the histories of others in order to promote ourselves. And I think we do ourselves a great disservice. That's my opinion. I know that most of you don't agree with that, but that is my personal opinion on the issue.
No, that's what I was asking, with the personal opinion and everything. Jacoby, you want to jump into the conversation? And I did have a quick question for everybody as well, and same for you, Sasha, also. But and And you kind of alluded to it, Derek. I'm still trying to figure out how a entire government collapses and all in that space. Because you mentioned the Netherlands, and apparently their entire government has collapsed and all in that space. And so I didn't know if y'all had any thoughts around what's going on over there and everything, because seems like with government being so big and massive, it would be hard for an entire government to collapse. But then apparently that's what's going on in the Netherlands with Mark Rutte quitting politics, and they're saying that the government has collapsed. Well, definitely, if y'all can share more about what you know about that situation, since y'all do more international travels and more are in the international political lanes, I would love to hear your thoughts around that, because you alluded to it earlier, Derek.
I think what you're saying around Europe at the moment is a significant push to the right. You're beginning to see that in Sweden. You're beginning to see that in countries where you wouldn't really expect, like even Scotland is now becoming a little bit that way. Ireland is becoming that way. Obviously, we see the riots in France. And there are some real questions about things like immigration. There are questions about maintaining culture, political correctness, all those sorts of things. And I think that the government hasn't done a very good job of actually, getting the consent of people that already live in the countries before they embark on these types of, programs, especially the immigration programs. So I wouldn't say that it's racism, but what I would say is that there's an unhappiness and an uneasiness amongst people who feel like they're losing their culture. And that's what's causing a lot of this.
I think in Europe, you've got to look at the whole thing. Why did the UK pull out of European Union? I think they had to accept anybody across their border. And that's a big concern when you don't have control of your border. And that's one of the big pushes, because we're seeing, a human trafficking cartel push people into nations to disrupt, because when you can disrupt, then government can then get more control and power and go, right, we're pulling away your human rights here and going to control the narrative here and what you can, restrict what you can and can't do. And I think that's the big push. What we're seeing here in Europe is a pushback against that, going, no, you're not doing that. We're going to maintain our cultural identity, our cultural sovereignty in these situations. And, Australia's a little bit different. Mark, as you highlighted, we're a big island, really. So our water boundaries has really protected us in many instances from that situation. So it's not necessarily a fair comparison with the Dutch farmers are facing, what the Australian farmers are facing. It's similar, but there's some distinct cultural differences here as well.
Toby and Sasha, I didn't know if y'all wanted to chime in on some of this discussion about what's going on over there in Australia with the farmers. I know that there was conversations, I believe, with the truckers there in Canada, and I think there might have been some farm issues there also, but I didn't know if you had any thoughts or things that you wanted to chime in. And of course, we'll get to other things going on in other parts of the world, including what's happening in Ukraine and what Biden is saying about the Russian war on Ukraine, which he said it must end before Kyiv can join NATO. But definitely, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what we're talking about right now before we get to the other stuff and any comments or questions that y'all have.
You're asking me about the Biden's opinion about the war in Ukraine?
I was going to get to that, but I didn't know if you or Jacoby had any follow-up questions for Derek and Shaquille. But yes, if there's not any further conversation about this, then yes, I definitely want to know.
Just a quick question. Well, I guess a quick two questions. One of the issues that we have in the States, of course, is how big farms are squeezing out the smaller farmers. And that's an issue dealing with not only legislation, because those big farms have the legislative power to push those different proposals through. Is that the same thing that's going on in Australia? And the same thing with, I know we were talking about the Aborigines and the farming themselves. I know here we have, for example, black farmers. And the problem with black farmers in the States is that they receive less in USDA loans, they're rejected more, and so on and so forth. Is that something that also happens in Australia as well, in this whole, in everything that you were just talking about?
No, that's really not an issue over here in terms of loans and lends and who does it. A farmer's a farmer here. And good luck to you if you're going to do that. I mean, I had conversations and doing due diligence. I was looking at a farm about a year ago about purchasing that sort of stuff, and I spoke to an accountant, and his question is, why do you want to do this? Because it's a tough gig to actually get into farming. It's not for the faint-hearted because you're open to the elements of the weather and all that sort of stuff. There is. I'm just trying to remember the first part of your question, Jacoby. There was
Jacoby was asking about
conversation around multinationals and
yes.
the
That's my problem with big government regulation in the first place, as you know from previous shows that I've been on, is that big regulation tends to favour big corporations because they've got an economy of scale and they're also able to ask for exemptions to the rules. And that's my fear. And that's the fear that was brought up in our meeting with the farmers, is that the small farmers will simply throw their hands up in the air and say, this is too hard. The price of farming land will drop and nobody will want it. And then big corporations can come in and snap up the land. And in the United States, you've only got 4 or 5 major agricultural companies. And all of those smaller farmers are basically contracted to those big 4 or 5 companies. And that's my fear of what we're going to see here in Australia. I mean, even at the moment, we've only got 2 major chicken in the country, don't we? Two major chicken plants or companies.
It's essential. I think there's a push and move. There's a lot of people who want to go back to knowing your local farmer, and they're very conscious of, imports that, The challenge with the food industry is getting it from the land onto the shelf in a timely manner where it still remains fresh. That's the whole challenge of this industry, and I think there's a room now. We've come out of COVID, lockdowns, and all this stuff. We're going back to knowing the local farmer, knowing how it's actually grown, having that relationship with your local farmer, and having that appreciation for what they do. And I think there's a bit of a push towards that. It needs to be more of an emphasis on doing that, rather than centralizing it to big corporations and having a big distribution center. That's kind of where I see Australian farmer doing that. But of course, there's always going to be the big money for the farmer, is particularly in the export area here in Australia, and working overseas and supply.
Yeah, but even on the push to getting to know your farmer, what we've seen is politics get involved in that. Now, I'm not sure if you're aware of it because I don't mention this very often. If you buy mushrooms from Woolworths in this state, they're all grown by a women's only mushroom farm.
Okay.
Why is that great for us? I don't understand.
The one that I'm hearing from the farmers is the legislation that's really expecting the lamb export. They've really clamped down the Australian government because the animal activists have really clamped down. We have some of the best care of animals and exportation of animals overseas, and they're killing that industry. Government is coming in and saying, you can't do this and do this in certain seasons. And this is what the sheep farmers are very, very concerned about, because not only, of course, from sheep, you get wool. Our merino sheep are very famous around the world. The fashion houses love our wool. But, of course, the meat as well is great food, great eating. And there's various sheep that do both or one or the other. And that's the big thing that's killing that industry, is government overrule and saying, well, we've decided that because this is cruelty to the animals that, and on an international sense, we've got some of the best care. You can't export like you have been. So it's just knocked back up and knocked back up and knocked back. And now we've got this over-compliance need, which is very vague. Nobody quite knows where they stand with it all. It's really hard to run a business that way.
It's the reason for Toby's question that, yes, big corporations will end up coming in because they're the only ones that will be able to. I think that's an inevitable result.
Yeah, because in terms of that local farmer push, that's actually happening here in the States as well. There are a lot of farmers markets. As a matter of fact, in Durham here, I think we have a daily one that is a farmer's market that happens pretty much every day in the middle of downtown. On the outskirts of downtown. Then there's one that happens in the middle of downtown that just shifted to 2 different locations in downtown Durham. So there's a big push for that. And then throughout the you have some local farmers that have different stands throughout all the area here. But I completely agree. The distribution network is huge, and that's the toughest piece to get through. And that's where those giant corporations have that big, I guess, monopoly on those distribution networks, similar to many of the other industries, like your music industry and so on and so forth. So you have those distribution outlets that are taking control of it.
Sasha will have to help me out here because I just can't quite remember the name of the network in Canada. It's CBS or something, something. They did an investigative report a few years ago on farmers markets, and they actually found that a lot of the stall holders weren't actually farmers at all, and were actually buying the produce from wholesalers and then going setting up stalls. And oftentimes, what they were telling you about the produce wasn't true. So, when it comes to having government regulation, I think we need to have some, because we need to make sure that what you're paying for is what you get, and you should be treated fairly. But I think that when government tries too hard or pushes it too far, it can become a hindrance. But yeah, look, I would suggest to everybody to try and eat local produce as much as you can and get to know the people that are growing your food. But that's easier for us to say in a semi-rural environment or in a place like North Carolina. I think it's much, much harder to do that if you're living in New York City or downtown LA.
I would definitely agree with that and everything. We're just going to switch really quickly and everything, and I kind of alluded to it earlier. But Sasha, I heard a lot of things that are going on with the Russian-Ukrainian war, everything from nuclear power plants being threatened to definitely even Zelensky saying that if, because I think Trump said that he could end the war quickly, and Zelensky was like saying, well, why didn't you do that when you were in office, and all along those lines. And I'm kind of paraphrasing what he said, but that was the gist of what the message was, and all along those lines. And of course, there are heavy battles going on in Bakhmut, and like I alluded to earlier, there is conversations around what is needed or what will be required in order for Ukraine to join NATO, according to the current president, Mr. Biden, and all along those lines. But any thoughts about all of this stuff that is going on there in Ukraine? Biden also says the U.S. has a rock solid relationship with UK, but definitely he has also said that the Russian war on Ukraine must end before Kyiv can join NATO. But I was wondering your thoughts about a number of these things, including the mercenary chief Prigozhin meeting with Putin, even though they're supposed to be at each other's throats and all along those lines. But any of the comments that you want to make about some of the things that I have brought to the forefront about what's going on there in the war between Russia and Ukraine?
Mark, thank you. There are a lot of things going on, and some of them are important, some of them are not so important. To try to make it from complicated side to simple, it's going to be like this. What is the mission and what is the goal of each army of any country? Number one is protect its border. In Ukraine, it didn't happen. The Russians went through the borders and occupied approximately 20% of the territory of Ukraine. Okay, number two. Okay, if you couldn't hold the border, then you have to make a front line which you can keep, so the enemy army will not proceed any further. Ukraine was able to do that, and Russians attack and Russian movements forward has been stopped. And finally, the number three. Number three is to destroy enemy's army. That's where Ukraine is here today. It has to destroy, forget about the territories. You don't need territories, because once you destroy enemy's army, you will have territories anyway. They will just come to you by themselves. All you have to do is destroy the enemy's army. So now the Biden's decision about providing Ukraine with the cluster bombs is the perfect one, because what else kills as many people as possible as a cluster bomb? Nothing. Never mind the nuclear weapons or so on, but in conventional weapons, the cluster bomb is perfect. It's a baby. It's a done thing. So once Ukrainians will get hold of that, and they continue very successful, very slow, very painful, because Russians are mined the well over 200 100,000 square kilometers. So this is why Ukrainians' movement is restricted to as much mines. And by the way, cluster bombs are very good for disabling the enemy's mines as well. So providing all that is happening, never mind the ATACMS weapons and finally F-16s. Although I heard now that Australia is discussing to giving their F-18s fighters, which in many cases are even better than F-16s. So there are about 40 planes because Australia is switching now to F-35, so they don't need this F-18 fighters anymore. So I would make it all very simple. Forget about all the noises about the peaceful negotiations where might be or might be not, and NATO, whether Ukraine will be admitted to NATO, and if yes, when, and through which procedure, and it will take another 27 years or so, and it's not an issue at all. I think at the end of the day, NATO will need Ukraine more than Ukraine NATO, because right now the Ukraine is very well equipped for the long war, and the more weapons and ammunition it will receive from United States and NATO, at least until November next year, when there will be a US election and Trump becoming president will restrict any help to Ukraine whatsoever. Okay, so but there's still a lot of time before that. So therefore, Ukraine looks very pretty to inflict further damages to Russia, and in my analysis, Russia will collapse under Putin's regime by itself, and it's going to happen rather soon.
Anybody got any thoughts around that? With
What do you think, Sasha? I've asked you this sort of question before. But let's assume you're correct that Russia does, in fact, collapse, or that there is a change of leadership, which is going to have to be inevitably at some point anyway, because Putin's not going to live forever. What's Russia look like, and what's the future of the innocent people of Russia who had nothing to do with this, that live perhaps in the more remote parts of Russia? What's their future look like after the collapse that you're talking about? What's the future of Russia afterwards?
Okay, we have to understand one thing. It's very important. Do Russia have a normal civil society, or they have a bunch of human-like creatures which don't have any say how the country is being run, what it's doing, or so on, and they're just good for consuming whatever food they can find and go to the toilet and sleep at night. You see, in this case, if that kind of society Russia has, I frankly don't have any idea what's going to happen to it. On the other hand, if they will be able to raise up from that level and become some sort of civil society, they will have to take in their hands how Russia is being governed, what's the future ahead of it, and so on. So it's really, really depends on the Russian so-called society, whether it's a civil or uncivil or what it is. So far, I'm for most, not all the population, but 80% of population, I'm of a very, very low opinion.
Hey, Sasha and Shaquille, this is for both of you.
I think I can help out Sasha here, okay? Because you want to describe Russia, all right? Here's Russia. It's a land of zombies and thugs, all right? The thugs rule, and the zombies do what the thugs tell them to do. So when the thug Putin leaves, a new thug will take its place. And the zombies will still be around doing whatever the thugs tell them to do. So
that may not be the case.
Russia,
That may
the
not
more
be
it's
the
going to
case.
be the same.
But hold on a second.
I can't agree with that.
If the Russian government...
Well, have you been to Russia? Come on, Shaquille.
If,
Hold
the,
on.
if the Russian
You know, they're all zombies over there doing what they're told to do.
No,
You
they're
got
not all
thugs
zombies
rolling
over
loose.
there.
It happens in every country. What's the problem?
What it is that, and we know this because it happens pretty much in every nation. And I'm in agreement with Shaq on this. They have innocent people that are civilized society there.
Yeah, they're called zombies.
They're not zombies. They are just like a lot of the GOP in this nation.
Oh, I knew that was coming.
Those are zombies too. What's the problem with zombies?
It's basically you have a whole government that runs a media that manipulates its people to making them believe something, and that's what RT and all the other Russian backed media does. The Russian society, I mean, there are tons of innocent people that are just living their lives and wanting to be innocent and just.
Jatovi, innocent people doesn't make a society, civil society or any kind. Innocent people, you know what? There are a lot of animals, most of them are innocent.
Sasha,
But that's all what there is to it.
in Canada, people voted for Rob Ford, who was a cokehead.
And what's your point? You said a few minutes ago, you made reference to the GOP. So I take it that the Democrats are in control of the media in the United States.
Point is, Shaq, is that people follow their media. They get stuck in their silos and they follow who they like. Right now, the Russian media controls roughly 80 to 90%. So they're going to follow that media and follow down that path. Right now,
wouldn't that be the same application to the Democrats in the United States?
I'm getting.
Hold on. What you describe now, what's happening in Russia, the same thing happened in Germany in the 30s with Hitler completely controlling the media, and that's where Germany went, and it all ended in 1945. The problem is that this type of criminal mafia regime can be toppled only militarily. There is no other way to get rid of it. No other way.
No. What can happen, and this is going to take a lot of effort on the people themselves, because again, you have a lot of innocent people. You have a lot of people.
Don't tell me about innocent people. I don't want to hear about the terminology. Innocent people are good for nothing, okay? Now, I want to tell you, you would say yourself that Russian people are 80, 90%, I think it's 98%, manipulated by this Russian propaganda machine. Okay, that's a fact. And that's going to be like that for another 155 years unless this regime will be toppled. That's it.
Yes, the regime has to be toppled by its people.
No, people are brainwashed. They cannot do anything. Brainwashed people cannot topple.
Sasha, here's the problem with your logic. If you throw in militarily having somebody go in there and topple that government, what does it make that government to the people that you're already talking about? That's 97% manipulated. That makes them
they have to be same as Germans after Second World War. All Germans still loved Hitler and believed that this is a tragedy, how they could lose a war or so.
Do all Germans
about 20 years minimum to get people back to their senses. Gotcha. In Russia, it will take 40 years, but it has to happen.
Information and the people speaking out. That's what it took. The military and the whole World War, that was all on top of that. But again, if you're going to topple any government, this is why China regulates what goes in and out of China from Google, because the information. This is why North Korea battles anything that goes in and out of North Korea. It's because of
that's why the Democrats want to censor people.
Why do you keep wanting to bring it back to there?
Well, because you brought it up before. You brought it up before about the.
Here you go, Shaq. Let me help you. Let me help you with that. Again, the most ill-informed group in the U.S. currently, and they've done studies, are the Fox viewers, who are Republicans. I can post that data. They've done studies. So when you argue that, hey, oh my goodness, it's got to be the Democrats, the biggest media companies are all conservative in the state. From local, Shaq, who has the biggest viewership? Shaq.
Chat. Who has the biggest viewership?
Not combined.
No,
combined.
stop.
Not
Stop.
combined.
Who has the biggest viewership? Let's do this one by one.
It's Fox,
do
but
this-
not combined.
Stop,
the
stop,
other
stop,
networks all are very,
stop,
very
stop,
bad.
stop. Who has the biggest listening? Who has the biggest listening audience? Who is the biggest
I've already,
listening?
I've already answered your question, and you're just coming back with the same
Fox
question.
was the biggest viewers. Conservative media is the biggest listening audience. So to argue any different, knowing the data shows how partisan you're trying to be at this moment.
You completely ignored my response because you wanted to make that point.
No.
The combined viewership of CNN and ABC and NBC, etc., well and truly outweighs the viewership of Fox.
Well, we
And
can
the
get to
reason
that.
why-
Hold on a second, Shaquille.
No,
It's actually time for the hour, and we can actually get to this on the media show. And I think that's at 12 or 12:30. I know that right now the economic show is getting ready to take place and everything along those lines. I was actually getting ready to get to some of the ethnic divides that are going on around the world, but maybe we'll get to that tomorrow. Derek, I was glad to have you again and to shed some light on what was going on in Australia and all along those lines. And always glad to see you shed some light on the different issues that are taking place. And contrary to what Shaquille says, I actually like some of the folks that are on the conservative side, including you, Derek, and all along those lines. So I have to tease Shaquille in that space. But right now we're going to get on out of here and have the economic show and all along those lines. So hopefully you'll come back in the other days this week as well. But we're getting ready to get
He'll
on
be
out
on
of here.
economics.
Cool.
He'll be coming to economics with me.
Thanks, Mark.
No problem.